It's changed tremendously. It doesn't mean it's perfect. In fact, it's far from perfect, as we saw with the latest coverage of the Olympics in Rio, right? Lots of sexism, lots of misogyny still out there. But compared to what it was, yes, I mean, we have a lot more coverage, number one, period. And number two, I mean, there's more content for sure, and a lot of it is very good content. So we have made great strides. Well, I think, it's sort of, there's always a pattern when it comes to underrepresented groups, right? First, there's, in general, mass media, they're just ignored, right? There's nothing about them at all. And then when there is some coverage, it first starts out with like, kind of what we call the festival and parade coverage, like, oh, isn't this interesting? And it's all very, um, uh, low stress, low stakes sort of coverage, which is better than nothing, I guess. And then eventually you do start getting into some more substantive issues, and I think you see that with coverage of women. Women, for a long time in the newspapers were just didn't, they really weren't covered very well, or they were covered in a very specific way, sort of like the Betty Crocker, homemaker, sort of stuff. Although there were some women's magazines, but even the women's magazines, with some exceptions, kind of focused on sort of homemaking, that sort of thing. And then eventually, I think in the 50s, 60s, maybe it started even in the 40s, I can't remember exactly, but there were women's pages. So you saw the women's pages in newspapers, and mostly, I think a lot of men just did not look at them. They were written by women, edited by women, and for women. And so they were sort of this ghettoized way to cover and appeal to women. Just some kind of basic, obvious things. I mean, I look at Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, she gets covered not just about what she's saying or what she's done in the past as far as her career, but they're always judging her on how she looks, what her hair is like, how her voice sounds, her weight, fashion choices. I mean, it's just nonstop, really. Just these things that really shouldn't matter that much, but apparently the media still focuses a lot on that sort of thing. Well, I do think that the women's movement in the 60s was a big deal. I mean, there were lots of issues within the women's movement. They weren't always open to uh, uh, lesbian or transgender women, for example. And so then they split off into, they call themselves the Lavender Menace, sort of tongue in cheek. Um, but I think, the women's movement and the launch of Ms., which is still around, it's actually a nonprofit, it's kind of an interesting model, but I think that had a huge impact. I think it also opened the doors for lots of women who eventually became very well-known journalists, to help them get their start. As far as LGBT, I mean, there were lots of different issues that were covered, but I think really when it was made public that Rock Hudson had AIDS, I think that was maybe 1984, I think that was a huge turning point because, because of this crisis, and because there was someone who was so well known who basically admitted, or people admitted, that he had AIDS and he had died of AIDS. It was a huge deal. It's hard for people now, I think, who weren't around then, to really kind of understand what a big deal that was. I mean, this was just something that was so undercover and not talked about, and almost shameful, and all of a sudden it just kind of blew the doors off of it, and people started talking about it. The news media started covering the AIDS issue and really talking about, without euphemisms, how do you get infected with HIV virus, and how can you prevent it. These were big deals. Yeah, it depends what kind of media you're talking about. Like if you talk about just kind of pop culture and entertainment, it's that same old stuff, right? Like who do you see on TV shows or in films? The Latina is usually the maid, or the grandmother, or a prostitute, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but just a bit. We're starting to see some change now, but very little. When you're talking about news media, I think a lot of it has been just invisibility, and then eventually you do start seeing some coverage, but again, it tends to be stories where you just sort of see the same person over and over and over. An immigrant from a Latin American country who's struggling, low socioeconomics. I mean, you don't often see people who, Latinas who are professionals, who are college educated, who are just quoted as, experts in the media. They're just not seen as anything other than, they're just not seen. They're sort of invisible. And I think that's sort of the next step, is just getting more women of color, and certainly Latinas, out there in the media as experts, or writing op-eds or writing stories, or just somehow becoming more present in the media than they have been. Well, I've been saying this for a long time, really my whole career, not just with women, but also with people of color, is we need to not only recruit more women and people of color into journalism, but retain them and help them move on up within a news organization so they become decision makers. And I think that really makes a difference when you're sitting at the table in a news meeting deciding on coverage, or who's going to get the top billing in a story, or the front cover of a magazine. I think it makes a difference when you have different kinds of people sitting at the table, arguing for important stories that might be overlooked by people who just really have no experience in anything other than their own kind of narrow experience.